Welcome everyone to the third Melges IC37 webinar. Tonight we have with us our coach Greg Fisher and Mike Marshall from North Sales, and our guest speaker Ben Kinney, the main trimmer from Members Only. I'm just going to give you a brief update on class news. There hasn't been a lot of development since last time we spoke. We still are looking at the 3 regattas that are scheduled by New York Yacht Club, at the one at the end of August, the postponed annual, the postponed race week, which is the end of September, and the nationals, which are early October. I think the real news tonight is that the state of Rhode Island has released some new rules on outdoor activities, and there's been an interpretation for sailing and racing competitively sailboats in Narragansett Bay. The club, New York Yacht Club, has just gotten those, and I know the flags and the powers that be are digesting those as we speak. But just to give you a sense, the new rules would allow crews who sail together consistently and create sort of a social bubble from people who regularly interact. So call it a pod, call it a family plus group, but that's what the state has come out with, and I'm sure every club or organizing authority will interpret that slightly. But it looks like there will be some sailing with boats larger than 2 or 3 crew in Narragansett Bay. So with that, that update, I'd like to turn it over to Greg Fisher.
Thanks, Phil. Do you want to click it on there, Mike? Before we get started, we want to thank the people that helped make these happen. In the background here for North Sales, we have Laura, who's been with us right from the start, who has set up the Zoom platforms and all our presentation support. And of course, Mike Marshall, whose videos and photos we've used right from the beginning. Ed Adams has provided us videos and support. And Morgan Kinney at Melges has made possible her videos and photos, and obviously helped us with a lot of the editing. So we are very appreciative to all they've done. And we are fortunate to have with us tonight Ben and Mike, and I can't imagine either one of them need much introduction, but their accomplishments are incredible. Ben grew up in Wisconsin, sailing from Milwaukee Yacht Club. He sailed collegiately at UPenn, and where he was 2-time team captain. He's also been captain and chair of the New York Yacht Club team race program, which, as we all know, is very impressive, and was on the winning Morgan Cup team at least 6 times. He sailed a bunch of different one designs throughout his career, but he's focused on the Etchells this past 10 years, where he's finished in the top 5 in the worlds twice and was the top Corinthian world champion twice. And that says a lot right there as well. Last year, he formed the IC37 team members only syndicate with Jay Cross and Hannah Sweat. And of course, as we know, they won the first class nationals last fall. When he's not sailing, he lives in Manhattan with his wife and 2 kids, and is a managing director at JP Morgan's corporate and investment bank. Ben, as we've all learned, is a very busy boy, and we really appreciate him taking the time to be here with us. So thank you, Ben.
Thanks,
and Mike grew up on Narragansett Bay. He's one of those kids who went through all the ranks of the Optimist, the Laser, and the 420. And Mike, too, was a college sailor and was also a 2-time captain at Conn College, one of the very strong programs. He's a champion one design sailor in a bunch of classes, including the J24, but he's won the North Americans in the J22 and the VX1, and is a J22 world champion. I think it's really cool that Mike is on the board of directors at the Connecticut Island Sailing Foundation, which helps youth sailors enjoy the sport. That speaks volumes as well. Mike is the lead and exceptionally talented sail designer for North Sails One Design. And just for knowing, he's the guy that designed your IC37 sails. So obviously he knows a great deal, and we're lucky to have Mike with us too. So the next one, Mike.
Oh, perfect.
So you're all going to see soon enough that we've updated our focus on this in our next two webinars. We're going to focus on upwind speed, boat speed setup and sail trim tonight for light air, and then July 9th, it'll be medium breeze, and July 23rd will be overpowered breeze. There'll still be Mike Ben, and I'll moderate, and they will still share about this focus, and again, in this one, and talk us through light air settings and onboard communication. Phil's going to manage the chat room, so please don't hesitate to use that to throw your questions out. And Phil will interrupt at the right time to pose these questions to Mike and Ben, so it'll be a great opportunity for them to answer your specific personal questions. And this next slide is kind of the lead for the whole talk. And these are three boats upwind and three different conditions that are going to represent our next three webinars counting tonight. And I'm going to let Mike take it from here, as him being the guy who designed the sails. You know, what are you looking for, Mike, in the basic setup, and maybe talk through some tuning and basic sail trim setup on as we go through here.
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting. Thanks for that, Greg, and you know, everyone else for being here. I think it's really interesting. In order to get to the bottom of the sail trim on the IC37, it's a little bit of a different puzzle because it's got a pretty short cord on the keel, and really what it seems is that in order to sail the boat quickly and trim everything correctly, you really have to be focused on boat balance and whatever form that takes, either, you know, with the crew weight, with the heel angle, or with the sail trim. And in order to get to that, I think we should actually ask the only driver that's currently talking on this call, and that's you know, that's Phil, and just find out what are you looking for when you sail upwind in, you know, in the range of conditions, but specifically in light air, and what are you looking for from the tiller?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Well, balance, I guess, light air, for me, it means having the boat trimmed properly so I'm not hunting for boat speed. I don't end up sailing too bow down, trying to keep the boat accelerated, and that I can maintain, you know, a pretty good angle, boat heel angle, and plus good VMG with the breeze, as opposed to when you start getting more breeze and the crew starts to hike, then you are in a situation where you're trying not to point the boat too much to compensate for the trim, either for weight or for sail trim, and then you're losing speed because you're pointing too much. In light air, you'd almost want to be in a position where you're not being forced to go too bow down.
Interesting. And one of the things you had mentioned before is that anytime the driver is trying to fix the, you know, feels like they're trying to fix an error in sail trim or in boat heel, that's what you're referring to when you say right. the boat is wandering, you're hunting.
You're hunting. So yeah, you don't want to be fixing, you know, you don't want to be fixing the boat speed issue with the tiller, either sailing too low, looking for breeze, or too high, trying to keep the boat flat or whatever in heavier breeze.
Right. So I think then if we look into that, there really are, and kind of how we've organized this webinar tonight, there really are three different modes, or three different sort of conditions that you have. You have sort of the underpowered condition, which we're seeing here on the left in our screen. That's really what's going to be the focus of tonight. And that really comes about in about, you know, in that 11 to, you know, to nothing, that 0 to 11 knot range is really where that sort of underpowered, you probably don't have much runner on yet. You probably have the crew to leeward. You might have a couple of people hiking. And that range then from sort of the 11 to 14, you're going to be looking for a pretty different balance of the boat. And it's what we're calling the powered range. And that's the thing we're going to focus on next week, and followed by what we're calling the overpowered range, which is another entirely different balance of the boat feel. And that's, you know, and that's going to be in the probably 14 to, you know, 14 plus range, maybe 15 knots, where you're starting to ease the sails and you really have the runner on. So So what goes into those is, as we said, the crew weight, the heel, and and the sail trim. But since we're focused on sail trim on the light air one tonight, Ben, why don't you just give us a brief overview of how you would set the boat up in terms of rig and boat settings and leads and jib halyard, for this light air kind of setup, so we can set the stage here.
Sure. So again, zero, called 6 knots of breeze, starting at the front of the boat. And quite frankly, on our boat, we spend a lot of time talking about matching sail shapes. I think most teams are trying to achieve that at all times. But as we're sailing out and getting ready, and as we're prepping for this, I talked to Greg a lot about this. I hate being the last boat out on the race course, because the first hour or 45 minutes of sailing upwind is where you're going to try to figure out exactly how you want your sails to look for that first beat. And quite frankly, it's often an iterative process. You never pull your sails up and feel like you're there right away. But broadly speaking, setting up the jib, you've got your leads in as tight as you feel like you can get away with. Your jib halyard in these boats, we found, some speed wrinkles kind of made sense. Going back to the main, you're sailing with no bricks under the mast. The main halyard tension, it's certainly tighter than you can get away with a little less jib halyard tension. Your main halyard's, up as high as you want. But the main sheet and traveler are sort of the controls that I'm most focused on as we're starting to set up. The runner's not a tool that we're using quite yet. We found in the really light stuff, the traveler up, and it's kind of hard to see on this picture, but you never really want the traveler all the way up unless you really need to be in point mode. So call it traveler half to 2/3 of the way up the traveler bar, and then I'm looking up the leech and looking at not the top tail, which is off the top of the fathead main, but the first draft stripe below that, and trying to get that flowing in these conditions. Call it 90% of the time. I think it's really easy to find yourself over trimmed and with these mains and still flowing a lot of the time. But I'm trying to get a decent twist profile in the main that I feel comfortable with, and then it's an iterative process from there. If that's the base setup, it's an iterative process between me and Hannah. Hannah trims jib on our boat and Jay drives, and talking to Jay about the feedback loop, what he's feeling in the helm, and balancing the boat that way.
So that's interesting. Can you talk us a little bit through that feedback loop as we're sort of watching this video, of one of the boats going upwind, about this feedback loop, as it looks like there's a puff coming in the video? Can you talk us a little bit through about what you're looking to try to do here and what you're planning as this, and what your communications are?
Okay, sure. So yeah, as you said, this is an interesting video because you can see the puff coming. I think it's all pretty obvious to everybody watching. In these conditions, once we've got the sails looking about where we want them, and the other thing that we do in practice is figuring out crew weight, where we're going to start, fore, aft, and weather to leeward. That's how you're achieving that heel angle here. It's much more with crew weight than with sails. And as the puff's coming, we're thinking about two things. We're thinking about our target speed, and are we achieving our target speed? How's our target speed going to change when that puff hits? But then also, are we sailing at a constant angle of heel? And that's something that on our boat we're very, very focused on, is how do we keep the constant angle of heel? We've got the angle that we all agree is the target. And in these conditions, moving our weight around weather to leeward to achieve that heel angle is crucial. And you can see here that, as that puff hit, you brought guys off the leeward rail and moved them up to the weather rail, and the boat really didn't rock up at all. It was very steady angle of heel the entire time.
Mm-hmm. So is there anything that you're looking for, since we know that heel is really critical, is there anything you're looking for besides moving to weather from the crew in terms of fore and aft, or in that regard?
That's one of the things that we start out thinking about when we're starting to tune up, is we look at how bow down we are. We're not trying to drag the transom through the water, but you definitely can get too knuckle down in the bow. That's one of the things that we're focused on fore aft crew weight wise. In terms of sail shapes, one of the things in this video, it's kind of hard to tell, but I would guess that this is a big enough puff and it looks deep enough that the sail shapes are going to be, you're making some macro changes. You're not just going to be making a small adjustment that you'll be, that you're going to give right back. This is, it's a puff that, like I said, looks fairly deep. So you're going to potentially be changing where your traveler is. I would guess you're changing your main sheet tension pretty meaningfully. It's not just a small click in. It's a change that you're going to be living with for a little while. And so that also, that's an adjustment that when you're making a macro adjustment like that, you got to be thinking about all the other controls in the sail to make sure that you have the right, make sure you have the right trim. One thing that we look at on our boat every day is the crossover point on our main leech in the center line. That's something, it's a gauge for us. We broadly have it around where the reef point is, plus or minus a little bit. But if we're thinking about twist, if we have a twist profile that's very wrong, you'll see that crossover point is either much higher or much lower.
So you're really looking a lot at that crossover point that's sitting there.
Yeah.
And that interesting.
Does it change much, Ben, from the different modes you're in, from light to medium to heavy?
Yeah. Certainly light to heavy it does. It does drop down a little bit. I mean, you're sheeting harder and harder throughout the conditions for sure. So yeah, it does change a bit, but I wouldn't say it's, it doesn't move up 8 feet or down 8 feet.
So that's a cool guide. When you look at that from below, like where you're trimming from, what are you looking for there to kind of give you a good eyeball on that, and so you know where that is?
I literally have, either I do it or somebody else on the boat stands right at the back of the boom. There's enough room where you can stand back there and just look up and see, okay, it's 6 inches above the grommet, or it's 18 inches above the grommet, and that's way too high. And then we make the adjustment from there.
So when we talked about fore and aft crew weight, what is there any tell for the fore and aft besides, is there anything we can hear or anything along those lines that you guys look for?
So like I said, it's a conversation about how much we're digging the bow or dragging the transom, and it's one body moving, fore and aft a little bit. The person who's kind of the crew boss on our boat is typically the one who's making that assessment, and then moving the body, the 1 or 2 bodies fore and aft, depending upon where we want to be. And that's a macro change as you go up in breeze as well, right? And that's something I'm sure we'll talk about as we talk about heavier air conditions.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing that I think is really interesting in this video is, if we were to pause here and we were to kind of, get a good bead on the area right in the back of the boat and look at the tiller is really straight here. It's certainly not being pulled to weather. And I think it might be safe to say that if you feel like you're pulling the tiller to weather, something's wrong, and it's generally that your main's over trimmed. I know you had a discussion about that at one point, Ben, and what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so so a couple things. One is, as we're going through this, I think it's important to recognize that the class is a year old, and we're still very much learning how to sail these boats, and there's no one way to sail these boats. And so I'm sure some of the things that we do will change in the next year or 2 years. And the Etchells, we set the boat up dramatically differently now than we did 10 years ago. So what I'd say is when you're asking about sort of helm here, in these conditions, I'm trying to, and I know it sounds crazy, I'm trying to sail as loose leached as possible, but enough pull and enough return that Jay's not reaching off the race course and that he's got a little bit of feel. In these conditions, I feel strongly, you really don't want to, bring the runner on unless you can, unless you need to firm up the headstay a little bit. So we're trying not to touch the runner to solve the helm problem. We would probably do it with sheet or maybe a little bit of trab, but probably a little bit of sheet. And that's a conversation that I'm having with Jay constantly is, how's your helm? And I'm looking down, I can see it. I can often, you know, he's got the better feel. I can often tell before we have a problem that we've got an issue. But it's a constant conversation between me and Jay. You know, is he feeling okay? Is he hunting for it? You don't want to be too helm neutral, but at the same time, I know that if I shut that main down, then the main is the engine of the boat. So if I've given him too much leech tension, if I've given him leech tension so that he has feel, you know, you can easily overbake it.
So Ben, I got one question from the crowd, and one is, yeah, we mentioned targets, or you know, making sure people are, you're keeping the boat going. The question was whether the printed targets, the targets we got with the class, are they the ones you're using, or have you established your own, or is that something you sort of developed by just going boat on boat and knowing the range?
So for our program, you know, obviously you're gonna have variation speedos, right? So that's I think you have to normalize for the fact that no two speedos are gonna be the same. I would say, and our results last year, we had a period in the middle of the year where we were just going not well at all. And so we, you know, our targets really moved around quite a bit. I would say, generally speaking, we were trying to sail to the printed targets in the middle of the year, adjusted again, like I said, for the speedo. And I think that we found ourselves a little slow. I think we were a little too bound up oftentimes as we were getting to those targets. And I think once we let freed our leashes up a little bit and sailed a little bit faster than the printed targets, we tended to do a little bit better. Particularly in these conditions. Again, you don't want to be reaching off the racecourse fill, as you said, but I would generally err on the side of being fast, because with the shape of these foils, the second you get slow, you're going to get past. It's very hard to get the boat going again. So to answer the question, I think by the end of the season, we generally coalesced around a view that we were trying to sail a little bit faster than the printed targets.
Got it. Thank you.
But this is a good video where, you know, the targets are changing here. That's one of the things that I think is really crucial. And you talk about the communication on the boat. It's not just resetting your sails and trying to sail for the same target. This is a juicy puff. This has got a few knots more pressure in it. Your targets are going to actually jump fairly meaningfully here. So communicating once you've made that, like I said, the macro adjustment, you know, I'm talking to Jay, and really it's a conversation between me and, you know, Benj about, okay, where do we think the new target is? Is it 0.3 of a knot faster, 0.2 of a knot faster, whatever it is, and then hitting the reset button with the skipper about trying to make sure we're hitting it. You know, I think it's pretty crucial in a situation like this.
Right.
So what I think is really interesting here is I think that the thing that you said about the faster than the targets is key. And in reality, if you think about targets, they're assuming that the boat is never going a speed slower or faster than the target, right? And so you can sort of pull something out of wanting to go faster than the targets, because your boat is never going exactly that speed. It's always a little faster or a little slower, and maybe at times exactly that speed, and then a little faster, a little slower as you hit waves. And it speaks to volumes to what the boat wants, which is with such a short keel, such a short cord on the keel, that you get all of your lift by going fast. And you know, the keel and the rudder for that manner, you get all of your lift by going fast. So the fact that you said you want to be going faster than the targets probably means that on average you're probably maybe a touch faster, but at times maybe a touch slower, and it's putting you, you know, probably right in the range. But it does speak to the fact that the boat really is looking for speed and not really a height mode, which I do think goes to, you know, the rest of our discussion on the sail trim, does it not?
I
think it's fair. That's right.
Well, and Mike, it's very different from many other boats that people sail, where you can squeak a little bit of height out of it for a little bit, but you just don't dare do that here, because you lose that flow. And as Ben pointed out, it's so hard to get the boat back up to speed and reattach, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think in a lot of boats with much larger keels, you can really squeak that height, because you've achieved with more drag and larger keels, you've achieved hull speed. and hull speed is, there isn't anything faster than hull speed, and so you just need to translate the rest of the energy into height. And in this boat, there is faster always. But you just end up reaching, and your VMG is worse. And so because you can overcome that drag factor by putting the bow down, and increase the lift off your foil, you just seem to be better off going faster and faster instead of trying to really push that height envelope.
Mm-hmm.
So Ben, if we were to do, I remember you had said that maybe the jib might be, kind of the first thing that you set, and then you use the main a lot to kind of adjust the jib from from the balance the jib is created. So you're setting your jib first, and then you're using your main to really fine tune the balance of the helm and get the boat to going. So just talk us through a little bit of jib setup here, and there's pretty different setups between these three different boats, but maybe in light air, I mean, there's a variety of different ways to set it up, right? And as you said, there's a lot of different, the boat's only been sailed for a couple of years, so there's a lot that could be changed and might be changed. But talk us through a little bit on jib setup here and what we might be seeing.
Sure. And this is actually a question I meant to ask when we were prepping for this to talk about. My impression, and it's been a few months since I've been on the boat, but my feel was that the jib always looked punchier. It always looked like a deeper jib than the main. On average, the main looked like a flatter profile always than the jib, and so that does impact sort of where your halyard tension is, where you have your leads. But yeah, I agree that so broadly speaking, we set up our jib. I wouldn't necessarily say we're setting our main up off of our jib, but we are, once we get the jib in a place where we sort of feel happy with our leads, that is the basis for a lot of what we're going to do. I'd also say, and this is just kind of the level set, this is something we do in the Etchels a lot, and we haven't done it yet in the IC37. It's a different team, but in my Etchels team of Sennett and Clay Bischoff, Clay does bow, and we've created our own sort of lexicon for how we have our sails set up. And like I said, I think it's always really important to have your broad strokes, your main and jib profiles in this looking pretty similar. So we think about it like gears in a car, gear 1 through 5, and we talk about sheet tension and twist. We always talk about twist first and then sheet tension, but 1 being the most amount of twist, and 5 being the least amount of twist, and then 1 being the least amount of sheet tension, and 5 being the most amount of sheet tension. So sort of think about it like, you get in your old manual car and you're going through the gears. 1 is kind of like maybe right out of attack, and you're the slowest, and you kind of have to work your way through the gears to get to 3rd or 4th gear. And when Clay and I are talking about it, we'll literally just say, okay, I'm a 2 and a 3 right now. And if Clay says that, I know exactly what he means. And I think that's a pretty straightforward way to communicate. And it works. We haven't done it yet on the IC37, but I expect that's something, we'll have something along those lines. In these boats, yeah, there are 3 fairly different setups with the jib. I would say, and I'm not looking at our jib leach profile nearly as much as Hannah is or Benj is. But what I'd say is that the first jib looks the deepest to me, just kind of looking at the draft stripes. And if I had to guess, they probably have the least amount of halyard tension on. The leads, kind of hard to say because they're all slightly different angles. But it looks to me like the first jib is set up to be the most powerful of the 3, the jib on the left. And kind of working across, looks like the jib on the right has the least amount of twist. There's no value associated with that. It just looks like that's how they've approached it. And you can see, whereas in the jib on the left, you can see the wrinkles at the halyard, and the jib on the right, the halyard looks a little bit firmer. And I'm guessing that's how they're achieving it by their depth.
Hey, Ben, as we got into the boats early last year and people were sailing them, it seemed that the jib lead, the port starboard lead was coming in further and further and further, and light air, no wind like this, flat water, and light air. You guys have your lead almost all the way in, or within the first inch or something like that.
Yeah, it's a pretty. They're fairly in board. I think it's like I said. Just I think when we're setting it up, it's try to have them in as much as we can and feel like we're getting away with it.
Got it.
Yeah, interesting. I think it's really interesting what you said about the jib looked a little bit deep, and coming from the sail design side of it, right? It's this is the kind of boat where if you were to do an inventory for offshore racing, you would have you would have probably 3 or 4 jibs in the design. And when you have an AP jib like this, it tends to be on the deeper side, just because you really would like the power in sort of the light air, and you're looking to a little bit of twist in the breezier stuff, and that depth a lot of that depth can go away, but you end up not being able to sheet it as tight. But looking at these 2 setups, for sure, I would definitely say that that there, or 3 setups, that the halyard is very, very loose on the boat on the left here. And I think what's happening there is, if you were to look at that sail with such a loose halyard, you're actually ending up losing the mid leach, because you've got no tension in the sail, and you've got no vertical tension in the sail. So actually what happens is the sail just falls to leeward in the middle. And so it makes this look of this sail that's very, 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 very tight in the bottom, very closed in the bottom, with a lot of return down low. And then it ends up with a sail that's pretty wide open on top. And that would be really good for waves, but at times, they can be a little bit too extreme in those conditions. And correct me if I'm wrong from what you've seen there, Ben, but it's there's times where it can be a little bit too extreme, because you're just actually shedding power out of the top of the jib.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Mike, if the halyard's loose like that, would you also be flattening the entry out in such a way that it makes it hard for Phil to drive without the boat wandering a bit, without a little bit of fullness in the front? Would that make it a little less forgiving?
Absolutely. I think, depending upon how much, even if you were in a swell or any kind of a wave, especially in this condition, I would think that, with that super loose halyard, and you might even have a little bit of rudder on to firm up the forestay, just because of the waves, that's going to make the entry even narrower, and it's going to make it even more difficult. For sure, I don't think you're looking to have the sail be, bone tight, and you're not looking for the draft to be pulled super far forward. But, at those times when you're really getting into scallops, Ben, how many times did you look forward in light air and see that there were scallops versus just wrinkles coming off of the hanks?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fairly obvious when you've overdone it with these sails on too little halyard tension.
What is the tell that you use?
So actually, I think the point about losing the middle of the jib is actually is quite good. It's also, how evenly the tell, and Hannah's all over this. I mean, it's something that Hannah's looking at constantly, and it's driving the discussion, multiple discussions about how much rig tension we feel we want, but how evenly and where our leads are, but how evenly the telltales are breaking up the sail is the other I think fairly obvious tell.
Mm-hmm. So if we were to jump to the other slightly more extreme example, on the right here, and in this case, I think it's critical in this breeze again is how much your telltales are streaming on your jib, and I would say 100% of the time your upper telltales should be streaming, and if they're not, it really is a very quick break. Break in the boat and to the boat speed. And so, Ben, is that something that you would see as well?
100%. It's something that I'm, because like when I'm looking at the main, for example, I'm just focused on that top telltale. And like I said, I do think there are some times where it becomes hard to shut it down. But I agree, it's streaming 95% of the time in these kinds of conditions.
Yeah, I think this boat on the right here, they obviously have a bit more halyard tension on, and they've got quite a bit of a tighter sheet, but for sure the top of the sail is, is significantly further in. You can see the spreader marks, and it's 2 or 3 inches further in compared to the boat on the left, and really, really, really tight. And you can almost see it in the attitude of the boat, where if you were to look at all 3 of the boats, the 2 boats on the outside, and they're all in very similar conditions, actually have everyone on the boat stacked to leeward. And, and the boat in the middle here actually has, it has a couple more people starting to move a little bit more to weather here, where they're not all lined up right on the leeward, the leeward lifeline, and really trying to put heel in the boat, because I think they've gotten pretty close with this upper jib leach about, the balance between having power and, and sheeting it too tightly. Is that something that you see as well there, Ben?
Yeah, I think that's fair. It just, to my eye, and again, we're looking at leach snapshots all day. You see the moment in time. You don't know what happened 5 seconds before, 5 seconds after. But it looks like a much more uniform leach profile, a much more uniform twist profile than either of the other 2 boats.
So, go ahead.
Got
Bill.
one question for the audience here. Talking about batten crossover for the full length batten on the top of the jib in light air. You guys have a number when that happens, when you put that in, take it out?
Ben, I'll defer to you on this one.
It's a good question, and I'll be honest, it's not necessarily the part of the boat or the decision tree that I'm always involved in. But I think broadly speaking, when we feel like the boat's powered up is when we're taking it out. And I think it's before 11 knots. I think it's like, and I'm sure Hannah will text me that I've gotten this wrong in a second. But I think it's probably around 9 knots. We've got everybody up on the rail. And when you're losing the top of the jib, when it's no longer like the nice uniform twist profile, but when you're really losing the top of the jib, and I think that's broadly when you kind of have everybody up on the rail.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I'd probably say, when we designed them, I think it was probably, expected even a little bit lower than that, but obviously a little bit of sea state and wave dependent. And, I think the thing to think about on it is that if you think that the heavy batten is overpowering the shape of the jib and the pressure that the wind can put on it, it's probably time for the light batten. And really what that happens to is, if you look up at that stripe that's pretty close to the batten, and the batten looks straight and not deformed, then it's probably time to take the step down. But I figured, Ben, we could let you use your lifeline here now that we've been questioning you, and you can phone a friend and phone Hannah for us and find out while we're on the subject.
Hey, can I ask both you guys something? Ben, you made a point that, when you look at the jib, it always looks a little deeper, a little more powerful than the shape you look at in the main. And when you look at these 3 jibs here, they're all very different in the foot, in that bottom quarter up off the deck. And obviously the lead is a big part of it. The sheet trim is a big part of it, but do you use that as a guide? Or how do you use that as a guide? And Mike, you obviously know what you're looking for as a designer too.
Okay, so Hannah just texted me saying we were spot on with our crossover, so answer that question. Thanks, Hannah. I think the other control that really drives a lot of what you're asking about, Greg, is halyard tension, right? I mean, it's jib halyard tension is really it's the same thing as moving your leads around. So that's something that like I said, I'm not quite as focused on a minute by minute basis in our boat. But when I do look up at the jib, and it's making sure that I sort of feel like the draft stripes, again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but we've got a draft profile that matches what we have or what I'm trying to achieve in the main. And if we're dramatically different, then discussing with Hannah, okay, I think you're deeper in the foot than I, and I'm trying to depower in some way, whatever the comment is. And then one of us will make an adjustment. We don't both adjust, because then you overshoot on one side. But yeah, it is something that we're constantly talking about, is, how we have our sails set up and whether we we feel like we're trying to achieve the same thing.
I think it's also interesting here that, you know, and it's the same thing that we've seen a lot of times, the sails can be deeper in the foot than you think, you know, because they are end plated to the deck. You are getting, you know, drive from that lower section of the sail. And so, you know, a sail that's off the deck is probably going to be flatter in the foot, you know, and to a certain extent, but you can, when it is end plated, you are separating the flows so that you don't have the possibility of a vortice off the bottom of the sail as much. And so you're definitely, with more attached flow comes more drive and more depth. And as long as the boat can handle it, you can do that quite a bit in the boats. I'll also say that it's interesting that you said so much about, you know, broken record on the halyards, Bennett. You know, if I were to set a jib up on the boat, I think the first thing that I would look at would be the halyard, because it does change everything else in the jib. You know, by moving the jib slightly further up, you're changing the lead, you're changing the, you know, every other position. So really your first control is probably your halyard, and then it's getting the sheet in the right place, and then it's actually looking at your lead. Because, you know, if you don't have the halyard right and you go and get the lead correct and then you go and adjust the halyard, you're going to be right back adjusting the lead again. Is that kind of the process that you guys follow?
Absolutely. And yeah, exactly.
Perfect. So in general then, you know, it seems like with the jib in this condition, you're really looking to be on the, you know, on the inside of that track, you know, potentially the furthest forward, the furthest hole inside. You're looking to have some grunt in the bottom of the jib, and you're looking to have that top telltales basically flying, you know, 90% of the time, 90 to 100% of the time, with, you know, with maybe just ever so slight wrinkles coming off of the luff of the jib. But how does that then interact with the main? What are you looking for in the main setup? You know, like we're showing in the next photos here. What are you looking for in that main setup to, you know, to kind of match that jib trim profile?
Sure. I guess so as we move on, the one other thing that I'd say, I think it's important to recognize as we kind of wrap up on the jib and move to the main, is I think in these conditions, we are the most dynamic with our jib trim of any of the conditions that we'll talk about over the next few weeks, where the halyard is constantly moving up and down. The jib sheet is constantly in and out. We're moving we're moving where our leads are much more actively than we are in any other conditions. Some of it's just boat setup. You know, we can't cross sheet our jib in these boats. So, you know, our ability to, you know, use our jib in puffs is much more limited, but it's also because the impact of going from 4 knots of boat speed to 4 knots of wind speed to 8 knots of wind speed is massive in these boats. We find that, you know, or even 5 knots of wind speed to 6 knots of wind speed is quite a big, you know, setup change. We're incredibly dynamic with our jib sheet, with our jib trim in general. And then sorry, Mike, going back to your question on interplay between the main and the jib, if you go forward a slide, there's a pattern here. I guess the main on the left is the deepest. The main in the middle, I think, has got you know, a fairly uniform twist profile. The main on the right looks to me like the leech is the firmest of the three. Again, not saying fastest or slowest, but firmest of the three. And I would say too, I actually think these three boats have, broadly speaking, matched their main and jib profiles relatively well. Perhaps the boat on the left has I would say a deeper, a much twistier main profile than the jib. I think the boat in the middle has achieved fairly consistent profiles amongst all of them. And then the boat on the right, I mean, you can even see sort of that looks to me like all the way through their jib leech is firmer as well. But the interplay, so, you know, again, as we're sailing along and we're sailing through, you know, varying conditions, Hannah and I are discussing what she's doing with her leads, what she's doing with her sheet tension. I'm listening to what she's doing and, quite frankly, making adjustments, focusing on what our target speed is, how we're achieving that, listening to Jay, getting the feedback from Jay around, you know, he's starting to helm up in the puffs, or, you know, even just sailing along, he doesn't have any helm, he could use something to lean against. and I can give them that for a second without shutting the main down, I'm okay with that. Or if I find that, it's more than a second, maybe I was under trimmed before, and so I'm going to make a macro adjustment with the main. But if we're, again, thinking about dynamic conditions, if we're going into something new, we're going to try to change both sails in the same way. Again, if I'm dropping trab, or I'm starting to trim a little bit firmer on the main sheet, then Hannah probably has a click that she can trim out on the jib.
I think that's really, really interesting, and sort of, again, what we're seeing here is that the crossover between the two sails, and that kind of also leads us into that traveler. So that the comment that you made before about that intersection point, we can see a lot more here. So why don't we just jump back to that for a second, and let's see, just give us a run through on what you're looking for here so we can see it on a comparison.
Sure. So if you look at the boat on the left and you just draw, if you're to stand at the transom in the middle of the back of the boat, you can see that crossover point is pretty low. Now the main looks very deep and very powered up, but also very twisted up top. So the crossover point between where the leach of the sail is at the middle of the boat is probably a little bit lower than I'd be looking to set it up. So I also think this traveler looks a little bit low as well, kind of from what I can tell in the photo. But so I would be looking to bring the traveler up just a little bit, probably trim on just a little bit as well. I think get away with both in that situation. That'll shut your leach down just a little bit, but it'll also maintain a twist profile as you bring your traveler up. If you look at the boat in the middle and draw the same arrows, you can see it looks to me like that crossover point is higher up. Again, like I guess that's right around the reef point in the main, maybe a little bit above it, but it's in the ballpark. It's in the ballpark on that, and that broadly looks like a good twist profile. I think that boat, which is the reason it's a nice twist profile. It's always been caught me that.
And speaking about the traveler too, you guys don't look like you're all the way up to get that twist profile. Have you guys found that that's pretty quick to not be all the way up?
Yeah, I think the only time that we on our boat are trab all the way up is when we need a point card, and it's not an adjustment that we live with for all that long. So if we've got somebody in our hip that we need to shed, the first adjustment is trab all the way up. If we are we need to live off of somebody's hip, trab all the way up, and we just make it work for as long as we can and try to kind of scratch and claw and fight to maintain our targets. You find that on ley lines a lot, or you find yourself in a tough lane. Sometimes you find it off the start, quite frankly. And that's actually one of the things that we try to do a lot in the IC37. We do it in the Etchel a lot, is like figuring out what the various modes are for the various conditions during our practice. So the hour before, when we're setting the boat up, we get kind of our base setting, and then it's okay, if we need to go into point mode, what does that look like, and how do we achieve that, and how long can we be sailing at our targets for that mode? Or we need to go bow down and either rumble over somebody, or we got somebody tack on us and we're not going to tack for a long time. We got to figure our lane up. What are the adjustments that we need to make for that? But I think that traveler is for us, it's really it's the point card when we need to go high. That's the only time we leave it up. And the second I can drop it off, the second I can get it from as high up as it is, I'm living for that. I want to get it back to a more normal position because it's a break.
Yeah, and a normal position seems to be with that boom, maybe a boom width above center line. That seems to be a fairly good crossover. Maybe boom and a half width above center line seems to be, from what you're saying, a pretty normal position for the boom to be in.
In these conditions, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But from an overall perspective, really, as we can see in the photo to the left, just having the traveler up and not having the main sheet on, or on the photo to the right, having the traveler down and having the main sheet on, can really change what your boom height is. So the main sheet is really a big driver here. And I've always used this sort of very top batten here, just at the stripe, as, at the very back, probably the back, third, or maybe even the back quarter of it as a tell for myself in these boats, because I think that when that is actually hooked to weather, you can have the telltale flying, and the sail is actually basically too tight for the boat. So what's your tell that you're using up there to know that your leech tension is good?
I do think you're right. I think that you can effectively have a shutdown leech and have that telltale still working a lot of the time. I think the tell for me, it's a little bit less up there than it is in the boat. So again, if you go back to this notion, and sort of my process at least is, I often don't really know where we are on the race course because I'm focused on looking up at that telltale, looking at the speedo, communicating with Jay, having a good sense, kind of looking back at the sheet, but I'm kind of cycling through within the boat the entire time and not really looking around a whole heck of a lot. That actually for me was a big change versus the Etchells, where I was a little bit more head out of the boat than I am in the IC37. But the tell to me is really less about sort of when, yes, you can sort of see when the batten's hooked for sure. But it's more about, okay, Jay and how he's achieving his target, whether the boat is sort of, leaping towards that target or kind of struggling when puffs hit. It's a bit of it's less of sort of like a tell up there than it is something that's happening within the boat, and our ability to constantly be sailing around our target with the angle of heel that we want.
So what you're saying is when you're shy on target, your answer is easing the main and not just putting the bow down. It's actually putting the bow down might not be, or forcing the bow down might not be the answer. It really comes down to easing the main.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In these conditions in particular, just to, and one of the things, I think it's different on every boat, but I found that a little goes a long way with the main. You can give it, a 2-inch ease or an 1.5 ease on the main sheet and really free up the leech pretty quickly. If you're kind of close on trim, I guess is what I'd say. Like you don't need to do a very large adjustment. And oftentimes you see the boat all of a sudden, just free up and leap in speed, and then you can kind of start the dance again, where you're figuring out if you're trying to click that back in and what the point is where you do click that back in. And how long you can keep it click back in before you start to shut it down again.
Before you start to shut it down. The really telling thing here definitely has to do with, the way the boats are heeled, and the one on the right-hand side, that's a pretty quick tell to what you're talking about, right? If your boat is heeled over but not going fast, there's your answer, and that's really that attitude of the boat, and it kind of does go back a little bit to that boat balance comment that we were talking about before.
The one thing I'd say you can kind of tell, and it's a little bit hard because the picture is slightly cut off. If I had to guess, the crew weight is much further forward on the boat on the right, just based on how the transom is relative to the water, at least from what I can see in the photo. It doesn't necessarily look like, and on the margin, I'd say the boat on the left is dragging the transom through the boat, dragging the transom through the water just slightly as well. So it's, you get a much better sense of looking at the boat from leeward, but that's one thing that does appear to be the case here. And the boat in the middle looks relatively well balanced.
With crew weight as well. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Hey, you guys, when we were rehearsing, you guys were talking about, it's also, I don't want to say easy, but possible to under trim the main and have the top two open for the balance for Jay to be able to steer. And I'm just curious, Ben and Mike, what you're looking for when you'd want to trim the main and put the Traveler down to help Jay. I mean, I guess my understanding, listening to you guys, is that the shot on the left, maybe they're too open, right? And obviously the shot on the right's too closed, but is the shot on the left going to give up a lot of, like you're saying, Mike, the ability to drive the boat forward and give the boat some more heel because it's so eased? Just curious. I thought you guys were talking about that, and I found that really interesting.
I have a horror story from an Etchells Worlds where I under trimmed a main for an entire beat, and we went very, very backwards very quickly. So I'm always scared of under trimming the main and not being able to sail upwind. But at the same time, like I said earlier, I also never want to be tight leached because, once you're slow, it becomes very hard to. So it's finding the edge finding the edge of trim. And that's always something with the main, whether you're sailing 6 knots of breeze or 16 knots of breeze. And I'm always thinking about is where's the edge where I'm going to make Jay squeal one way or the other, that he needs something to lean against, or that he's fighting the boat way too much, and then back off from the edge just slightly. The tell in the main, I find when I'm under trimmed is like you actually see it luff a little bit. I mean, it's very subtle, but you actually can see, along the luff, you can see small luffs when the boat either hits a wave or it's quite frankly looking at other boats. Not necessarily for what their trim looks like, but boats that are around us, and they've got to be nearby because 50 yards makes a big difference in how much breeze you're in when it's light. But are we sailing? Broadly speaking, are we able to kind of sail the same angle as that boat? And do I think that boat's actually sailing upwind in the right way? And if we're not, then maybe I'm under trimmed. If we're footing just too much and we're not gaining real VMG, then I may be under trimmed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the other thing that I think about on that is, when you feel the boat kind of hitting waves, even in light air, it wants to feel, unless they're really big waves, it wants to feel like it's pushing through those waves. If you're falling on the edge of under trimmed, the boat doesn't ever feel like when you get a puff or when you hit a wave like it has power. When the puff hits, the boat should feel like it actually wants to heel over a little bit more, even if it's only a knot or two increase. It should feel like the leech of the main is engaged. And if you're under trimmed, when the puff hits, if the boat doesn't feel like it engages, if the rail doesn't feel like there's pressure in it, sometimes that's another, it's a little bit more on the feel side, but it's a good tell of that you might be a little bit under trimmed. It kind of goes to the point that Ben was making about the main slightly luffing, where it just doesn't power up when you're sailing along.
But I might interject here. I think one of the things you're trying to learn early on in the day when you're lining up with people before the start is where are you on that range? What is the range for the day on that trim? I think, this is all very flat water. Waves start to make a difference, and the range gets wider. But it's one of those things where it's nice to line up with people on that and just see what that looks like.
Mm-hmm.
So, did you have a question from the chat?
There was one question from the crowd, and it's probably a generic one, not just light air, but generally, Ben. Did you guys, on your bricks, this question everybody's going to ask, I'm sure, for all the sessions, did you go up incrementally, or did you have 3 gross settings, or how did you guys think through your bricks? Did you?
Lots of voracious debate on the boat with a lot of cooks in the kitchen. We generally, a rule of thumb was so no bricks until we had everybody up on the rail. And then, I would say more or less we followed the tuning guide. It wasn't like, I don't think we were too far off the guide in terms of when we were going up on our bricks or down on our bricks. I think the feel that I had was when we were bottomed out on the runner for a condition and we started to overbend the main for, with the trim that I wanted, that's when we went up a step on our bricks.
Okay.
It really, to me, had as much to do with how much runner tension we had as anything else. But I think kind of broad strokes that also matched the tuning guide. And then did we have sort of like kind of big, just only a few settings? The answer is no. I mean, we debated between increments an awful lot. And it, again, that's one where I'm sure there's not a single answer in the fleet right now. I think you asked 10 boats, 10 different answers to how they're thinking about the bricks. But like I said, for me, it was about runner tension.
Yeah, and I sailed with a couple of different main trimmers last year, and there were different philosophies for sure. Some, 1 or 2 were all or none. One, I tend to be more incremental. Then there were people who had sort of 3 major gross settings and tried to decomplicate the thing. But yeah, no, I think you're right. I think it's one of those topics that people keep talking about.
I think the one thing that we kind of settled on our boat was when you can get to fully bricked, if you can get to fully bricked fastest, then that's a good thing. That if you were kind of erring on the side of a couple of mils shy or a couple of mils more, we tended to go go with more.
I think we're the same way. So.
That's not bad for a tuning guide that was written before the boat was launched. That never works out that way. You're not supposed to admit that, Ben. You know that, right?
I'm not a sailmaker, so.
But anyway, I think, this is really important, and in the main here, it really is the driver of the boat. So if you were to think about it, the jib is the jib is the thing that you're setting to to first take the airflow across the boat, and then it's basically redirecting that flow across the backside of the main with regard to the slot. So the main is really a lot of an extension of the jib, and then the leech of the main is the thing that's really giving you your point and driving you upwind. So this traveler height, these relatives that Ben's been giving here, I think are really important and really good. But at the end of the day, it really tends to be getting out on the water and and doing it, and actually actually checking your main trim for from when it compared to other boats. But it all does come down to this boat balance thing, doesn't it? It all comes down to the fact that you really are looking for all of the trim and everything that you've talked about tonight, Ben and Phil and Greg. Everything that we've talked about seems to come down to this boat balance concept, and within that concept is the heel and the crew weight and the and the main and jib setup. And in light air, it seems to be that the heel and the crew weight probably are weighted to be 70% of what this boat balance solution is on how to sail the IC37 in light air. And the main and jib trim are really there to optimize and optimize around what you're trying to achieve with that heel and that crew rate. Is that a okay way of thinking of it there, Ben?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it changes in conditions. So I think whereas, we spend a lot of time talking about crew weight tonight, the next one of these, when we're talking about sailing in 11 to 14, everybody's on the rail. Maybe they're a bit dynamic as you sail into lulls, but but in these conditions, balance is really achieved. I think you're spot on by crew weight.
And then it's really that feedback from the driver to be able to say, yeah, I'm pulling on the tiller too much, or man, I just need a little bit more to lean on, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Greg, any other thoughts for these?
No, I thought it was interesting how you described, Ben, that Hannah is working to set the jib for I don't want to say a relatively, the guides that you use are maybe a little more constant. And I remember when we were talking about this before, how big the range is that you go through trim in the main. Obviously not in lighter. I think you said it was like 2 to 3 to 4 inches in lighter, but in breeze is 12 to 14 inches to keep the boat balanced. And it seems like you're describing Hannah gets the jib in a pretty solid place, and then you're the one that's constantly is pretty impressive, tweaking the balance, just like you're saying, Mike, for Jay, so that the boat is always on a roll forward.
Yeah, like I said before, the main is the engine of the boat in these conditions, all conditions, but in these conditions in particular. So small adjustments go a very long way.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Great. Well, I think that's our hour plus a little bit. I want to again thank the team here, Coach Fisher and Mike Marshall and Ben Kinney for sharing their secrets with us. And I know these things take a little bit of prep, so all the time before that. I think the next one is going to be pretty interesting. Light air is always fun. There's a little nuance to light air. It's very different, but as we get into a little more breeze and we get all the crew on the rail, I think the next session is going to be interesting. Just see what mode changes and what the cycle looks like for main and jib trim. So I hope everyone will join us on July 9th for medium breeze, and have a good 4th of July between here and there. And thanks again, guys, for tonight. Thank you.